Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History. Today, we'll be talking about a number of the causes of the American Revolution, including one of the most infamous, taxation without representation. Now, the Peace of Paris had ended the French and Indian War, may have ended it for the French, but did not necessarily end it for the Indians. The war had, after all, begun over land claims, and settlers streamed into the back country and over the Appalachian Mountains even before the war was over. After all, Daniel Boone explored what is now Washington County, Tennessee in 1760. At least according to legend, killed a bear and carved his name into a tree to commemorate that in that year. Although Daniel Boone was a fairly educated man, and some people think that this graffiti was a forgery, as he probably could have spelled words like killed and bear and his own last name. The famous tree was blown down in a storm in the early 20th century, but copies were made of the carving, and the wood was turned into gavels and given to prominent local judges. Whether or not this tree was real, or Daniel Boone really hid in Boone's Creek, he unquestionably visited Upper East Tennessee, hunting, and others followed him to settle, which provoked the Indians living west of the Appalachian Mountains. And shortly after the French and Indian War ended, Indians, under the leadership of an Ottawa chief named Pontiac, who briefly united several tribes, began to attack British forts and settlements around the Great Lakes. They killed around 2,000 soldiers and settlers before being put down by the force of British arms and by gifts of blankets, which had been infected with smallpox. But the British don't want this kind of thing anymore, and so the new King of Great Britain, George III, issued a proclamation, the Proclamation of 1763, which effectively drew a line, the Proclamation Line, down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and made it illegal to settle west of that line or even to trade with Indians living west of that line without permission from the British government. Now, the British did not plan to ban trade or settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains forever, but they wanted to limit it, to carefully control it, allow gradual settlement and regulated trade that would avoid, they hoped, major conflict with the Indians. The colonists, though, who had fought to open this land to settlement, felt betrayed. And this would just be the first of many misunderstandings between the British government and their American colonists. And it is important to emphasize that these colonists saw themselves as British and were deeply proud of that. As members of the British Empire, they enjoyed more freedom, more self-government than anyone else on earth. And they attributed this to traditions of liberty, dating back to time immemorial, and enshrined in written documents such as the Magna Carta of 1215, the Bill of Rights of 1689, and to what some political theorists described as a mixed government, combining the best aspects of three different basic forms of government. Now, many colonial leaders, and world leaders in general, were well educated in the classics, were familiar with the work of Greek and Roman historians and philosophers, including Polybius, a Greek historian working in the Roman Empire, or the Roman Republic at that point, which was becoming an empire, in fact, if not yet in name. And he had stated that mankind naturally starts off in a state of chaos until a strong leader can unite the people behind him, creating a monarchy, meaning in Greek, rule by one. And this, Polybius said, was a good thing, one good, strong ruler bringing peace and order. But eventually a single ruler, if not himself, perhaps his heirs, will eventually become corrupt and will rule not for the good of society, but for his own profit. And so a monarchy, which was basically good, would deteriorate into tyranny. But eventually, the best men in society would become tired of this tyranny and would band together to overthrow the tyrant, and would in turn rule society in an aristocracy, rule by the best. But as their power became entrenched, they would come over time to rule as well for their own self-interest, to protect the power of their small group, indifferent to or even deliberately exploiting the less fortunate. And so aristocracy, rule by the best, would devolve into an oligarchy, simply rule by the few. Eventually, the people as a whole would rise up against this corrupt elite and using the power of democracy, rule by the people, to create a society in which everyone had rights and influence and a say in control of society. But, as you may know, what is popular is not always what is best. And the people as a whole could also seek out their own self-interest. And eventually democracy would collapse into what Polybius called ochlocracy, which is hard to say and to spell. And so English speakers of the 1700s simply called it mob rule. But eventually a strong leader would emerge from all this chaos, and the cycle would begin again. The British, though, avoided this by combining in the British Constitution all three forms of government. The British Constitution, it's worth saying, both then and now, refers not to a single written document, as we are accustomed to in America, but rather to kind of the concatenation of all the different written laws and legal decisions and traditions that had formed the British government over the years. In the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, again, various legal decisions and other things all combined together to create the British system of government, which again combined all three of Polybius's government forms. The king, of course, was the monarch. The aristocracy was represented in the House of Lords, where every member of the hereditary British nobility and all the bishops and archbishops of the Church of England had a permanent seat. And democracy was represented in the House of Commons, where property-owning Protestant men could elect representatives. And each of these branches restrained the other. Most importantly, the House of Commons had the power of the purse, the ability to create new taxes. In the American colonies, most colonial governments more or less replicated this. Most had a governor, typically appointed by the king or the proprietor, although in a few colonies directly elected. Although a royally appointed governor sometimes never bothered to go to America, he would take the prestigious title and the royal paycheck, but not actually go to his colonial capital. So every colony had, and some colonies were outright governed by a lieutenant governor, who was typically born and raised in that colony. The aristocracy was represented by a council, sometimes elected by leading members of society, often chosen by the governor from leading members of local society. And to imitate the House of Commons, every colony had some sort of elected assembly. Most called it an assembly or a general assembly. A couple, I believe, had a House of Commons. Virginia famously had its House of Burgesses, the original representative government in British America. And although suffrage, the right to vote, was pretty limited by today's standards, in Britain itself, about 2% of British subjects could actually vote, thanks to property qualifications that kept actual voting in the hands of the fairly wealthy. That was still far more than any other country. and the British often referred to the subjects of other monarchs, particularly the French, as slaves. To be sure, some British people did feel the monarchy ought to be more limited than it was. The political party known as Whigs, for example, did believe that the king still had too much power, even if he could not really create laws or directly create taxes on his own anymore. He still had the ability to appoint people to many prestigious and well-paid offices, which he often used to influence or just outright bribe people to support his policies. But overall, most British subjects had faith in the virtue of their leaders. And virtue, as it was meant in the 1700s, political terminology, meant putting one's personal interests behind the public good. It didn't necessarily mean you were virtuous in all ways, but in political virtue did mean putting the public good first. And most British people, both in Britain and in America, saw themselves as part of a great British tradition and were proud of their rights as Englishmen. Now in Britain, including America at this time, it was believed that liberty was based on property. Only someone with enough property to be financially independent could truly be free. It was still a society which emotionally was tied to the land. Although Britain was now a pretty mercantile society, most people were still farmers, and most people's notion of true wealth and being able to support yourself, came from farming the land. It was believed that only if you had enough land to support your family could you be independent. If you worked for someone else, if you rented your dwelling place from someone else, your employer, your landlord could have too much influence over you in many ways, including your vote, which was public. And that was one reason why Britain and all her colonies had property qualifications to vote, to make sure no one else could influence your vote, or at least reduce the opportunities for that. And so under long-standing traditions, and also the newer theory of contract theory, advanced by John Locke, for example, a just government could not just take a free person's property. And yet, the government takes our property all the time in the form of taxes. Except they don't just take it. Taxes were, at least in theory, a gift from the people to the government. But when you go down and buy something at the store, you may not just at that moment really desire to give a gift of precisely 9.5% of the purchase price to the state of Tennessee and the county of Washington in the form of sales tax. And yet, in a way, you have chosen to do that through your elected representatives, which was why only Parliament, and specifically the House of Commons, elected by some of the people, had the power of the purse, the legal power to create new taxes, because they were the representatives of the people, and they guarded that power very jealously. Indeed, this power of the purse allowed the House of Commons over time to gain more and more control in the British government, as the Lords and the King would have to compromise with the Commons and give up powers to them if they want the Commons to pass new taxes that they wanted. However, while British people in Britain and America saw themselves as being part of the same tradition, in fact, some traditions of government had changed over the centuries that the peoples had been a part. There was, at least in America, a theoretical division between what they described as direct or internal taxes, which were taxes on your property, to raise money to support the government. And external taxes, or indirect taxes, which taxed trade, to make money, to be sure, but primarily to regulate commerce in the name of mercantilism. Again, the economic theory that trade with other countries and their colonies ought to be limited. And the colonists claimed to believe in this, although in fact many ignored it in practice, as smuggling was rampant, but rarely interfered with by the British government, at least up till now. The British largely saw this distinction between direct and indirect taxes as totally artificial and pointless. On the other hand, in Britain, a theoretical division was developing between actual representation, which is what most people expected of their representatives, that the man you elected to represent your county or your city in Britain would actually represent your interests, or at least the interests, again, of the city or county that elected him. And this is also what Americans certainly expected of their representatives in the House of Burgesses or General Assembly. But some British politicians were beginning to advance a notion of virtual representation. That because they were all British. No British subject would do anything to hurt another British subject. And so, all members of Parliament should try to represent all British people, the interests of the kingdom as a whole, not just their own city or county. And furthermore, they did represent all British people, not just the 2% who could vote for them. Now, many people, even in Britain, were not real keen on this theory. And certainly most Americans felt it was entirely unrealistic. Even if it worked within Britain, and that was questionable, a member of Parliament from somewhere in England, let alone Wales or Scotland, could not really represent the interests of someone in, say, Connecticut or Georgia. And so most Americans felt that only actual representation could legitimize the creation of new taxes, at least internal taxes on people's property to raise money for the government. External taxes, though, were okay. And there were some external taxes, at least on the books, prior to the 1760s. The Molasses Act of 1733, for example, taxed molasses, principally to regulate trade between the Caribbean and Britain's North American colonies. But again, these taxes were not heavily enforced. Many Americans grew rich off smuggling. One of the most famous was allegedly John Hancock, or at least his father, whose wealth he inherited. But the French and Indian War left Britain deep in debt. Although a debt they were able to manage, although they are still paying it off. Indeed, Britain's ability to finance wars and other projects was much more advanced in other European countries. Some historians have suggested that Britain's banking system, even more than its army or navy, is what allowed it to conquer the world in the 1800s. But the debt was still heavy, hundreds of millions of pounds, which in those days was a lot of money. Furthermore, Britain now had to police the Proclamation Line, and General felt a need to bring the American colonies under closer supervision, and felt the colonies who had begun this war ought to pay for it. In April of 1763, just as the French and Indian War was winding down, George Grenville became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and set out to pay off that debt and have the colonies help. Indeed, bring the colonies under closer control in general. One of the first laws passed under his leadership was the Currency Act of 1764, which very strictly limited the conditions under which the colonies could issue paper money. Paper money was seen as a threat to the local economy, because as more and more paper money was printed, it led to inflation, in destabilizing the economy, in particular, undermining the value of money that was owed to creditors. Although, because there was very little silver or gold in North America, at least the British parts of it, there really wasn't much gold or silver to make hard money out of. Colonies were dependent on paper money, even if some rather overdid it. But the real issue, or at least the main issue, was to protect British merchants and other creditors who didn't want to be paid off in paper money that was constantly being devalued. So this was a real burden in several ways to the colony. Also in 1764, the Sugar Act cut the old molasses tax in half, which ought to be a good thing, except the Sugar Act actually tried to enforce a tax which at this point had not really been collected much. And it gave British authorities more power for search and seizure, and to find potentially smuggled sugar and sugar products like molasses. Colonists didn't see why they needed more taxes, certainly didn't see why they needed more royal officials, especially now peace had arrived. Worst of all, people accused of violating this law were not tried by a local jury of their peers, an ancient English tradition, enshrined in writing and dating by tradition to time immemorial. Rather, those accused of breaking the law would be hauled back to Britain and tried in Admiralty Court by British naval officers, a trial most colonists feared would not be fair to them at all. As most colonists, or at least some colonists, saw it, the British were changing the rules and threatening their rights as Englishmen. Still, most colonists, if pushed, would accept that while the Sugar Act might not be ideal, it was legal, it was within the traditional powers of Parliament as an indirect or external tax that regulated trade for the whole empire. But George Grenville was not done. Also in 1764, he announced the passage of the creation of a Stamp Act, although it would not go into force till 1765. This was a tax on most printed documents, legal documents, magazines, playing cards, newspapers, many other paper goods, and some other things too, like dice. And so this was a direct tax levied directly on people's property, an internal tax that would raise money for the government. It wasn't really about regulating trade. Worse, from the point of view of British politics, it especially hurt newspaper editors, businessmen, lawyers, legislators, the kind of people who could organize resistance. Always difficult for lots of people, because while the tax on individual items wasn't that high, it had to be paid in specie, gold or silver, not colonial paper money. As I've already mentioned, hard money of that type was awfully scarce. Loyal British subjects, like Benjamin Franklin, the famous writer and scientist, who at this point was actually working in London as a lobbyist for Pennsylvania and I believe some other colonies too. And Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, strongly advised against the Stamp Act, said it would deeply offend the colonies. But their advice was ignored. And agitation spread to several colonies. Down in Virginia, Patrick Henry famously began his career denouncing the Stamp Act in the Virginia House of Burgesses. Pamphlets were written condemning the act, but they were ignored by Parliament. So eventually representatives from 9 colonies met in New York. It was known as the Stamp Act Congress of 1764, hoping to plan a cohesive resistance to this one act, while still remaining loyal to the king, as long as they could, which turned out to be till July 4, 1776. The colonists would insist they were loyal to the king. Their complaints were against members of Parliament, against the king's advisors, against various royal officials, but they were always loyal to the king, until they finally felt they couldn't be. But that time is not yet. The Stamp Act Congress did not really accomplish much, except set an example for meetings of delegates from multiple colonies to discuss resistance to British laws. And other groups appeared as well, such as the Sons of Liberty in Boston, led by Samuel Adams and many others, John Hancock, Paul Revere, but Samuel Adams was probably the most significant leader. And they took a very active role, sometimes a vigilante role, in harassing anyone trying to enforce the Stamp Act. Threats of violence, and occasionally actual violence, meant that by late 1765, all the officials who were supposed to sell the stamps were afraid to actually do their duty. And 1766, the act was repealed, and the sugar tax was reduced. And this should have been a success for the colonies. But, to prove a point, Parliament then passed the Declaratory Act, declaring they had the absolute right to pass any laws whatsoever that were binding over the colonies. And so the crisis was not over. And this would indeed be a pattern. Over the next decade, Britain would pass an unpopular law, the colonists would protest, and Britain would kind of back down, but then pass another law, once again infuriating the colonists. And who knows, had Britain simply stuck to their guns and really enforced the Stamp Act, maybe they could have made things stick and we'd be speaking English today. But by backing down, they showed the colonists that resistance more or less worked. But then by passing new acts, like the Declaratory Act, it kept the colonists, or at least a vocal group of them, consistently angry. Still, Britain tried to deal with this in other ways. In 1766, William Pitt was named Prime Minister. And of course, he was viewed as a friend of the colonies, thanks to his very America-focused strategy during the French and Indian War. But now that peace had come, he got pretty sick of the colonists pretty quickly, feeling they were complaining about the simple costs of being part of the greatest empire on earth that protected them and gave them access to the greatest markets on earth. Likewise, his Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, became frustrated, and Townshend had what he thought was a pretty good idea. He would, in what came to be known as the Townshend Acts, use indirect taxes, give the colonists what they said was okay. Taxing imports into the colonies: glass, paper, lead, paint, and tea, and some other goods as well. And these taxes were supervised by a board of customs commissioners headquartered in Boston. But they were deeply resented, especially in Boston, where the main customs office was. The taxes resulted in protests, boycotts of the taxed goods, violence. Merchants, sometimes out of patriotism, sometimes out of fear of vigilante actions, signed non-importation agreements, promising not to import any of the taxed goods, which hurt the British merchants who had been selling this stuff to America. Those merchants, in turn, complained to Parliament. And this violence reached a climax in Boston in 1770, where, following a long series of riots and other protests led by the Sons of Liberty, more British soldiers were sent in to keep the peace. This just increased local resentment. Locals often teased and taunted the British soldiers, who were not allowed to respond. Until, on the night of March 5th, 1770, a crowd of about 60 Bostonians started harassing about 10 soldiers guarding the customs house. Once they were cussing at them, spitting at them, throwing chunks of ice, rocks, oyster shells. One soldier was hit with a club and knocked down. Angry and afraid, the soldiers fired their muskets into the crowd, killing or wounding 11 civilians, including the leader of the mob, an escaped slave named Crispus Attucks, who died instantly. A couple other men died on the spot. 2 others, I think, died of their wounds later on. The Sons of Liberty described this as the Boston Massacre. An engraving by Paul Revere, one of the Sons of Liberty, became a very influential piece of propaganda, showing, as you can see, the British soldiers simply mowing down a whole crowd of apparently innocent victims. Their blood pouring in the street, even the poor cute dog there at the bottom, in danger of musket fire. Eventually, these soldiers and the officer in charge were put on trial and were defended by prominent American John Adams, who, although a real critic of British policy, wanted to demonstrate that even British soldiers could get a fair trial in America. And of all those accused of murder, only 2 were found even partially guilty, and their sentence was reduced to, or their conviction was reduced to manslaughter, not murder. So rather than being executed, they had their thumbs branded. And Parliament again tried to temper their policies. King George III's friend, Lord North, replaced William Pitt as Prime Minister, and repealed all the Townshend Acts, except, to prove a point, the tax on tea. Indeed, this repeal of the Townshend Acts took place on the same day as the Boston Massacre. Had Lord North had Twitter, things might have gone very differently. After this, not much happened. The colonies were becoming more prosperous. Most were willing to live with the tea tax, which wasn't that high, the old tax on molasses, which was not that high. But some colonists remained angry and continued to keep each other angry through committees of correspondence, whereby some colonial leaders continued to try to organize resistance through committees of correspondence communicating across the colonies. Another way some colonies began somewhat working together. Then, in 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. This actually reduced the tax on tea, but gave a monopoly on the sale of tea in the colonies to the East India Company, a vast company that was in financial trouble, but in which many members of Parliament and other royal officials owned stock, whose value they wanted to prop up. So, while it actually reduced the cost of tea, it was seen by many colonial leaders, many colonists in general, as a very corrupt act to benefit a few members of Parliament and royal officials. Furthermore, it let the East India Company cut out the middleman and sell tea directly to the people, which hurt local merchants. It said it was a corrupt monopoly, part of an insidious conspiracy. Local merchants would be ruined, said local merchants, and then the East India Company could raise prices on tea once there was no competition. And of course it supports unneeded royal officials who will enforce the taxes. But honestly, most colonists didn't seem to care. Tea was very popular. Close to half the population drank it every day, and again, the tax was not that high. But a few agitators continued to stir up trouble. The Sons of Liberty threatened merchants and tax officials, so that many resigned rather than have boiling tea poured down their throats, or have their houses torn down, which was an occasional form of protest in the colonies, or most famously to be tarred and feathered. to be stripped of their clothing in public and have hot tar. Although, mind you, tar made from tree sap, which was awfully hot, but it was uncomfortable, not likely fatal, as petroleum-based tar would be, which has to be much hotter to boil properly. It had this tar poured over them or just painted on them. They didn't be rolled around and everything scooped out of the bottom of the chicken coop. Not just the feathers, but everything else the chickens let drop too. Uncomfortable, disgusting, embarrassing. Again, many royal officials refused to collect taxes out of fear. And finally, in Boston, a large shipment of tea, which was often shipped compressed into blocks like this. Large shipment of tea arrived in Boston Harbor. The acting governor, Thomas Hutchinson, said that because it had arrived in the city, the taxes must be paid. But a mob on the docks would not let the ships unload or sell the tea, yet the governor would not let them leave. Finally, the captain of one ship went ashore and asked for help. And that was creatively misinterpreted by the Sons of Liberty. About 60 of them, disguised theoretically, although people knew who they were, disguised as Mohawk Indians, went aboard the ships and dumped about 10,000 pounds of tea into Boston Harbor. And I would roughly estimate that to be about $4 million worth of tea today, although I may be mistaken on that one. About 2,000 Bostonians stood around and cheered this tea party. And there were other tea parties up and down the coast, and Parliament was not pleased. In response, they passed what Parliament called the Coercive Acts, and which the Americans called the Intolerable Acts in 1774. And there were 4 Coercive Acts. And you know in general what the Coercive Acts did. You don't necessarily have to know the names of each individual ones, but it won't hurt as the name more or less says what it does. The Boston Port Act shut down Boston Harbor until all the tea was paid for that had been destroyed, as well as the taxes due on that tea. The Massachusetts Governor Act removed Thomas Hutchinson from office and replaced him with a military governor, General Thomas Gage, a man who was actually relatively sympathetic to the colonists, but also was unwilling to put up with nonsense. And he brought with him a large number of British troops to occupy Boston. The Administration of Justice Act ensured that royal officials charged with any crime would be tried in England, not the colonies, and the colonists assumed this meant they could get away with anything. And the Quartering Act, which introduced troops to enforce these laws, required that soldiers be housed at local expense. And if Boston would not provide enough barracks, as they sometimes didn't, these soldiers could be quartered in the homes of private citizens who had to house and feed them. In addition to all this, the Massachusetts Governor Act also gave Thomas Gage the power to appoint his own council and ban the town meetings, so important to New England politics and culture. So these 4 things are the Coercive Acts, or Intolerable Acts. Parliament also passed another act, the Quebec Act, which the colonists considered to be a 5th Intolerable Act. This dealt, obviously, with Quebec. It preserved Catholicism there. It protected the French language and other French traditions, which by itself seemed threatening to the colonists because democracy of any sort, representative government, was not among those French traditions. And the Quebec Act extended the borders of Quebec all the way down to the Ohio River, and thus into land claimed by Virginia and New York and other colonies. And was seen by some colonists as kind of the first step to eliminating representative government in their own colonies. The Virginia House of Burgesses called for a day of prayer for Massachusetts And today, some people will kind of criticize those who send their thoughts and prayers to people suffering misfortune. But the thoughts and prayers of the House of Burgesses were seen as so threatening by Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, that he disbanded the House of Burgesses. They just went down the road and reconvened in the Raleigh Tavern and called for a meeting of all the colonies to decide what to do next. And so, later that year, delegates from 12 colonies, not Georgia, sent a total of 15 delegates to Philadelphia, where they formed the First Continental Congress, meeting almost 2 months, September 5th to October 26, 1774. Some of those delegates had to be sent from reconstituted assemblies, created illegally after 6 colonies had their assemblies dissolved by their royal governors. Some delegates, like John and Samuel Adams from Massachusetts, George Washington, Patrick Henry from Virginia, were pretty radical, were already considering a complete break from England. Most delegates, though, did not want to go nearly that far. By the standards of this group, John Dickinson and Joseph Galloway were seen as more conservative, definitely wanted to remain loyal to Britain, although they certainly had many grievances. It would not be correct to call them especially conservative. And one reason for their conservatism was coming from Pennsylvania. They represented many Quakers who feared that going too far would lead to war, which would be offensive to a pacifist group like them. Together, the delegates supported the Suffolk Resolves, originally issued in Suffolk County, Massachusetts, which called for no obedience to the coercive acts because Parliament, they said, had no right to enact them. Furthermore, the First Continental Congress resolved that Parliament did not and could not represent the colonies. Still, as I've already mentioned, most colonists did not want independence. They simply want a new relationship with Great Britain, maybe united under one king, but with separate parliaments. That was even suggested in what was in Galloway's plan of union, which would have united the colonies into one big colony, with an elected President General and a Grand Council. But ultimately Congress rejected that, although only by 1 vote. Congress supported non-importation agreements, non-exportation agreements, non-consumption agreements, with the exception of rice, which could still be bought and sold to get cooperation from South Carolina. Congress created committees of public safety, 1 per colony, to enforce boycotts, pass out flyers, protect people who supported Congress, and beat up people who did not. Relatively satisfied with their accomplishments, Congress adjourned, but decided they'd meet again next year, in May of 1775. And there were colonists who thought Congress and the committees of safety and the reconstituted assemblies were all going a bit too far. But they were mostly willing to go along. The leaders of this resistance were the same old respected men whom they had followed for a long time. People saw there were real problems and hoped this would be a calm, rational way of approaching them, at least relatively speaking. And people did see what was happening in Massachusetts, feared it might happen to them next. So boycotts were mostly followed. Militia units began to train more seriously, particularly the Minutemen of New England, who claimed they would be ready to fight at a minute's notice.